The first lecture was very much looking at the types of art that you can find in many American museums. It's also very much Japan looking to how it presents itself on a very popular level abroad. And the second part of this lecture is really about art education in Japan. And many of the works of art that I'm going to show you are not represented in any Western collections. It's really a kind of dialogue that happens within Japan, but it's also the type of works of art that are more likely than not to be designated as important cultural properties in Japan. For the Japanese, these are very important works of art. We are going to be looking at government patronage, art education during the second part. And as you can see, the Meiji government had a very, very strong idea of how it wanted Japan to be presented to the West. But it didn't always mean that there was one way of doing it. And I think you'll see in the second part that we're going to be looking at different strategies than what we saw in the first lecture. And you'll also see that in the second part, there are often opposing points of view. Each group feeling that they were strongly committed to doing the same thing, promoting Japan in a new era, presenting Japan and Japanese art as very much an equal of what was happening in the West. When the Japanese government was trying to develop its own institutions of governments, it was also trying to understand art education, and art education was a very important part and played a very important role in informing how people perceived things, how the world perceived Japan. One of the first things they did was they invited an artist, a group of artists from Italy, to come to Japan to teach at the Technical Fine Arts School. They had someone who taught architecture, a Giovanni Cappelletti, a sculptor, Vincenzo Ragusa, and then the man you see here on the screen, Antonio Fontanesi, to teach painting, and he came to Japan in 1876. You might ask, why Italy? Well, as I explained before, when the Iwakura mission was going around the world, they were looking at different countries and thinking certain countries did certain things better. And when it came to art, it was Italy. So they invited the Italians to come to Japan to teach them about art. And Fontanesi came, and he had a group of students who were very, very passionate. But you have to understand how rapidly things change in Japan during the time. Here, for centuries, they've been using brushes. Now he's saying to them, get rid of brushes. We want pen and ink. Or we want to do things in oils. There had been some experimentation with oils in the 18th century through the Dutch trade, but this again is another very radical way of looking at things. And to give you some sense of the type of imagery that Fontanesi himself did, here is one of his own paintings. He's very much a Barbizon type painter, very subdued palette, looking at landscapes, primarily landscapes, some of people. But this is the type of instruction he's going to be giving these young students. There was also another illustrator who was working in Japan, a man by the name of Charles Wirgman, and he taught one of Japan's first Western-style artists, a man named Takahashi Yui, who did this painting of salmon in 1877. Like many of the artists that you'll find, Western-style artists, he was a member of a low-ranking samurai family, so very educated people, very sort of the elite of Japan, looking to the West for new ways of looking at the world. And he opened his own school of painting. Just to give you some sense of how important the Japanese still feel that this type of painting is, you can find stamps with Takahashi Yuichi's salmon hanging off of it. It is a type of painting that very much they're learning Western techniques, looking at Western drawings, and getting some advice from Western instructors such as Fontanesi and Wirgman. This is a landscape that Takahashi did. He had his own son study with Fontanesi, And through his son, he learns about some more Western techniques, and then he decides to learn from Fontanesi himself. So he learns about Western perspective, and he learns about Western spatial arrangements. Although, as you can see here, with this juxtaposition of tree and background low-lying buildings off this hill on Otago looking down towards the sea, it's still rather, in a way, clumsy. I mean, you've got this large tree on the right-hand side juxtaposed with the low-lying houses down below. You can also see this very subdued, dark palette. But they were looking to look at Western oil paintings and trying to use Japanese subject matter. Here you can, just to give you some sense of that scene itself in photographs. So again, the view down below with the low-lying houses, which you can see in the upper section of the painting up above. Here's another artist, Asai Chu, who also studied with Fontanesi, and his painting, Spring Fields, he wants to use, again, looking at Fontanesi for his type of naturalism, but he definitely wants to use Japanese subject matter. He, too, was a samurai who then goes to Tokyo to study art. And I think I've put Asai Chu's Harvest here from Tokyo University of Arts on the left-hand side, and give you Jean-Francois Millet's painting on the right-hand side to give you some sense of the types of images that they're looking at, this darkened palette. And again, they're not learning from this firsthand about artists, although they have had Fontanesi himself, but largely a lot of their imagery is coming out of books and magazines and the like as they try to learn about Western art. This is one group trying to say, what should art be? What should painting be within this new era as Japan tries to modernize? But there were also contending points of view, and one of them was presented by a group that was supported by the Bostonians. So at my museum, the people who were most actively involved in the discussion were these four people who helped sort of form the basis of the MFA collection. Edward Sylvester Morse, who was a collector of ceramics, but also very known for his scientific work. Ernest Fenollosa, who went originally to Japan in 1877 to teach political philosophy, but got very involved in discussions about art and wanted to write about art, history of art. William Sturgis Bigelow, who was their very wealthy patron and who was here in Japan from 1882 to 1889, who supported a lot of these activities with his family's wealth. And then Okakura Kakuzo, also known as Okakura Tenshin, who, when at the time that you see in this photograph, was their translator, but would later on be the person who brings many of these ideas to fruition. And one of the things that Fenollosa and Bigelow and Okakura did was that, unlike some of the other people who had come in from the West, they looked at Japan and said, here is a tradition, here is a long tradition of art making. And they really wanted Japan to look again at its own roots, rather than saying everything coming in from the West is what you ought to be doing in this modernizing world. They were trying to get Japan to look at itself, its own history. So the eye to the past. As one sort of foundation for the development of a modern nation, that you don't do it out of nowhere. You don't just borrow some other country's traditions. You have your own traditions, and how does one then reinterpret them in this modern age? But they did things such as going around to different temples, as you see here. They went to Kofukuji, which you have the back of the altar at Kofukuji, and here at the Asian Art Museum, you have sculptures that were very much in this kind of condition when they were rescued from temples that had been largely abandoned because of lack of patronage in the 19th century. They also developed their own collections. So these are some of the works from Fenollosa's collection that then was purchased for the museum by Charles Goddard Weld in 1890. works such as the 13th century burning of the Sanjo Palace, or the 18th century Matsushima screen by Ogata Koden. And Bigelow himself, who during this time was going around looking at many different kinds of works of art, ukiyo-e prints, Buddha sculpture, paintings by eccentrics, swords. Bigelow himself gave over almost 60,000 objects to the MFA, Japanese objects. So it's very much wanting to learn about history, but also wanting to look to the future. And they felt as though you could not go to the future without understanding some of your past. And it was not that it was meant to be conservative. It looked conservative in light of what was happening with oil paintings, but it was a way of looking at the old and thinking about what would be appropriate for contemporary times. Fenollosa worked very closely with Japanese colleagues and Japanese artists, two of whom I show you on the screen, Kano Hogai on the left-hand side and Hashimoto Gaho on the right. Kano Hogai, sort of the sort of apocryphal story was that, he had been a member of the Kano school, the traditional painters for the military aristocracy. With the loss of patronage, both Hogai and Gaho were sort of left to their own devices and really cobbled together ways of living. And then it is said apocryphally that Fenollosa then said to Hogai, we can create something new. So that he became very closely allied with Ernest Fenollosa. And in 1884, they founded something called the Kangakai, which was a group of artists and connoisseurs. It was a forum for appreciating the old, but also planning for a new contemporary expression. The type of painting that Kano Hogai did was something like this, which on one hand looks very traditional. You've got an eagle in a ravine, a hanging scroll format. I'm sorry I can't give you, I couldn't bring an overall of the scroll itself, because if you saw the scroll itself, you'd understand there's some disjuncture. The mounting for this is electric blue. Just bright, bright blue. And when we looked at the prints before and you saw the colors of progress, well, think of the electric blue as being another kind of indicator of progress. It's an electric blue. But there's subtle things about this painting, too, that show you that it's a different take. I mean, it's a very traditional subject, an eagle on a tree. But look at the way that he handles the background, these mists, and then the sort of the way that the birds kind of swoop in and out in the upper left-hand corner. It's a way of presenting things you would not have seen in Japan before this time. Or you look at this painting, a landscape that he did. Foreground is pushed right up to the front, which you'll often find in Japanese painting. The background is juxtaposed against it. But look at the very odd angles as you come over those cliffs and look down below at the river, which is supposedly the Yangtze River down below. It's sort of otherworldly in a way, and a tilting, up and down tilting that you wouldn't find. Or the way that the rocks themselves, they are the outlines of rocks, such as you would find in a Muromachi painting. But look at the shading and the highlighting on it to create these forms that are very different from anything that had been encountered before. They're very bizarre in a way. Or this painting, for which he's very well known, another one of these Meiji period paintings that appears on Japanese stamps. If you're a stamp collector, you might recognize this one. This is known as the Heba Kahn by Kano Hogai. It's one of the last works that he did, and he did it in different versions, one at Tokyo University of the Arts and one that the Freer Gallery has, and there are other sketches for it as well. A very seemingly traditional subject, the Kanon, the Bodhisattva of compassion. But look at the little child in front in this bubble that's in front of it. There have been children like Sudana looking and observing and visiting sites associated with Kanon, but this is almost like a child appearing in a bubble and out of nowhere. And again, the difference between we often talk about the asexual nature of a Kanon or Avalokiteshvara, but here very much in the guise female guise, in fact, kind of the merciful mother. So these odd juxtapositions that you find in his works of art. Hogai died, and Fenollosa and Oka Kota were very much committed to creating another school of art. The Western style of painting that you had seen with Fontanesi had very much gone out of fashion. Japanese were looking again more inward, but they wanted to have a new Japanese painting, not just a repetition of the old Japanese painting. So around them, they formed another school, the Tokyo Art School, which is now what Tokyo University of Arts has become. And Hogai was supposed to be the lead instructor, but he died beforehand, and Hashimoto Gaho was the person who then became his replacement as the head of the painting program. Here you can see on the painting by Gaho, again, very much traditional subject matter, but look at the way that the waves are treated, with shading in those waves, not something that you would find in traditional painting, or the way that the dragon sort of swoops in out of the sky. And you can also see that it is not in hanging scroll format. It's sort of like those plaques that I showed you by Shibata Zeshin or by the Namikawa Sosuke of looking at a Western format, presenting something in a Western format. These paintings, too, were put into panels, and you can see in this illustration, this photograph of Fenollosa's living quarters at the university, on the grounds of what was the University of Tokyo. First of all, the Hogai painting I just showed you here, and here is Gaho's painting. These are both taken from Fenollosa's living room. The creation of this new Japanese painting, as you can see, also at work in Gaho's work. So then you've got a traditional subject. You've seen many snowy landscapes all the way from the Muromachi period onward in large scale. But look again at the way that the forms are treated, the shadowing, the highlighting that's happening on these rock forms. So it's creation of the synthesis, something that would be a new Japanese art for a new age. I think you can even see it more clearly in this hanging scroll. A very traditional subject, moon on a landscape. But look at the way that the moon, you can actually see the moonlight highlighting here, so that you actually see the moonlight here on the landscape. Or these very traditional rocks, but again highlighting down below where the seal is. So it's this new integration of old and new that one finds in the paintings that Okakura and his school were promoting at this time. Now, Okakura was the person who, Fenollosa came back in 1890 to Boston, and Okakura is really the one who took over the art school, what is now Tokyo University of Arts. But in 1897, he abruptly decides to leave the school. And he was really forced to resign, and he founds his own group called the Nihon Bjutsu, or the Japan Art Institute. One of the reasons for his leaving was that he had very different ideas, very strong ideas about how art ought to be presented, and so he goes off and he founds the Nihon Bjutsu. You can see them here dressed in their uniforms in 1898. And there is Okakura right there in the center. You might think that this looks rather quaint. To the Japanese at the time, it was a little bizarre. You don't have if you think that you look at the prints that I showed you with people dressed with bowler hats and everything, and then you think these people are walking around at the same time as those others that you saw walking along the Sumida River in their sort of very westernized clothing, some of them traditional Japanese, but then you see these people here, they really struck everyone as being rather bizarre, but it was a political statement on Okakura's, of Okakura's, and I think it must have been very difficult to be one of his artists working underneath him, having to wear this type of uniform, but that was his kind of statement as to how he thought Japan should look to its past for creating a new future. And he really came into conflict again with those people who thought that looking to the West and incorporating things from the West was how the new Japan should present itself. And so we have him coming into to conflict in a way with Kuroda Seiki, who was the artist of these two oil paintings. Kuroda Seiki, who had then become an instructor at the Tokyo Art School in 1897, and it sort of triggered this Okakura leaving. One of the reasons that Okakura actually left, because no longer was the curriculum at Tokyo School of Arts based on a traditional but a modernized view of tradition. It was putting West and Japan in contention with each other, and Okakura was forced to resign because it's not an arrangement that he dealt with very well. Kuroda himself was from a very aristocratic family, and he had gone to Paris to study law in 1884. But he ended up studying painting in France for 10 years. And I think you can see that impact on his work that you see here. He worked with a plein air realist, Raphael Collin, who used a very light palette. It was very much a reaction against the Barbizon works. And we had looked at earlier with Asai Chu and some of the Takahashi Yui, these very dark palette. Well, now the debates are sort of been summarized as it's the brown versus the purples, and you can see the difference in the palette. It's a much lighter palette, and it's not Impressionism, but it's incorporating some of the ideas of Impressionism into the work itself. And Kuroda begins teaching at Tokyo University of Arts in 1897. You can see here on the left-hand side a work that Kuroda did while he was in France, where he was studying at a place called Grès-sur-Loing. And then on the right, a painting that he did while he was in Kyoto, just after he returned to Japan. But you can see that the very light palette, again, not the dark browns that we had seen in the earlier oil paintings. You can also see that he's very, very comfortable both with Western subject matter and Japanese subject matter, which was just what was sort of he felt was needed for this new modern age. And perhaps one of his most well-known works, this one here, By the Lake, which he did in 1897. Again, a Japanese subject matter, but very much presented in a palette that contemporary Europeans would have found very much to their comfort and to their taste. So there are these two points of view. There was sort of this neo-conservative look of Okakura, and then you have Kuroda Seiki, a very much pro-Western look. You have Okakura dressed up with his colleagues in this ridiculous outfit, and you have Kuroda presenting himself very much as a man of the West. So you have these competing visions as to what art ought to be and how art ought to be presented in Japan. And where some of these arenas come are different art schools, different art circles. They're competing discussions about what art ought to be during this time. But it also, we talked about expositions like the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. Well, there's another one that comes up in Paris in 1900. And how is Japan going to be represented? Okakura put in a bid to represent Japan on one hand, but then Kuroda and his group did as well. And this was at the Exposition Universelle in 1900. And it was actually the Western-style painters who actually were the ones who actually represented Japan at the time. Shortly afterwards, Asai Chu, who I'd showed you, had done these very sort of Barbizon-style paintings. He also goes to France as part of the delegation at the time of the Exposition Universelle, and he goes to Grès-sur-Loing, where Kuroda had been. And you can see the change in his palette. I mean, he's very much interested in looking at landscape and looking at the different colors of the landscape, the way that light plays with the landscape, sort of in a sort of pre-impressionist work here of his own. Or this man, Fukushima Takuji, who was another person who came out of the Tokyo University of Arts, who does this painting of Lady with Morning Glories before he even goes to Europe, but then goes to Europe and creates these works here. And he studies while he's in Europe with Jean Carolus Durin, the same person who became the teacher of John Singer Sargent. So you can see that the Japanese are working in these very influential art circles, and it is certainly changing how they present themselves. I mean, without knowing this is by Fukushima Takuji, I think most people would think that this was a Western oil painting, or here this landscape on the right-hand side. But there are these contending visions about how does Japan present itself in the Western world. And Oka Kota is not about ready to give up. So he brings a group of artists to Boston, to New York and to Boston. And I show you the clipping from the New York Times when they come in 1904, and they're here in New York and Boston 1904 and 1905. He brings with him two artists, actually a group of artists, but the painters that he brought with him that were active in Boston were these two artists, Yokoyama Taikan and Hishida Shunso. And these are two works that are at the MFA collection. They brought, you can see what I'm showing, this will make a little bit more sense to you in the next slide, but they brought determined pieces, widths of silk with them. They brought the materials with them. They were of certain sizes, and very rapidly they produced paintings in the United States that then could be sold both in New York and in Boston. And these are some of these works. They were looking at a slightly different type of work from what you just saw with Kano Hogai and Hashimoto Gaho, although they're very much in their lineage. They were trying out one of these theories that Oka Kota had popularized at the time, this idea of modotai, which is not having any outlines. So you can see on the right-hand side with this moonscape, or in the sea itself, just the use of color. And they're very vivid because traditional Japanese painting, we usually back it with paper and then put it in a mounting, which then brings it down. But these are very lustrous because they were very temporary works of art. They were never backed with paper. So you're actually seeing the light going through the silk, which makes these paintings particularly lustrous. But this is their idea. Again, if Kuroda has gone to Paris and appealed to Western audiences with his oil paintings, this is Oka Kota making his own trip now to the United States, again making an appeal. And Oka Kota himself goes to St. Louis to talk at the World's Fair there about what painting ought to be. And again, these are some more works that are in Boston. A Taikan on the left-hand side, you can see just the haziness and this hazy technique that he thought, this atmospheric presentation with just the slightest details of the egrets that you can find down below, or this painting on the right. And I should give you a little bit of background of painting on the right. The painting on the right is a work that just came into our collection recently. I had been doing work for many, many years about this group of works that were done in New York and Boston when Oka Kota came with these two artists, and we had been reading about the presentation of them. And when I first came to the museum, most of the MFA paintings were just like you see on the left-hand side. They'd been taken out of, you could see this gold paper border around them, and I could read descriptions about the fact that they once had grassy mats. And, but trying to make sense of what a grassy mat was very difficult until someone brought in the painting on the right one day for an opinion. And I said, you've got one of the paintings. I've got that is the frame, that is the mat. I know exactly where this painting comes from. It's one of the paintings that was displayed in 1904, 1905. So now we can show you how they presented them. Again, these sort of traditional paintings that they're making compromises. They want to present it still within the Western context. So it has got a mat and it's got a frame that goes around it. But again, you can see this sort of no outlines in it, trying to use color. Fairly conservative now in our way of looking at things, but at the time they thought was rather revolutionary, that this was a way to synthesize the best of the East and the best of the West in a way that they could create a type of more universal art that would appeal and would represent Japan in this much more modern age. Now I'm going to make a big leap from paintings to postcards, and some of you may know that the MFA has a collection of 20,000 Japanese postcards that were given to us by Leonard Lauder of the Estee Lauder Corporation. And a lot of people ask me, so why postcards? Why do you have postcards in your collection? And I hope to show you how incredibly important postcards are for telling the story of Meiji art. The postcard itself was an art format that was first introduced in Europe in 1869. And by 1873, introduced in Japan. Postcards themselves were a monopoly by the Japanese government. All the designs were coming through the Japanese government until around 1900, when they decided that they could release their monopoly. And it became the most widely used format of art. And it was also critically important because it meant that artists could exchange ideas very rapidly. And it turns out that many of the leading artists from the Meiji era actually composed works of postcards. So I had shown you works of the artists who had gone to the Exposition Universelle in 1900. Some of them stayed in Europe, such as Asai Chu, as I mentioned on the right-hand side, or Wada Eisaku, who was another oil painter. They go to Grey-sur-Loing, the place that Kuroda had been before, to do their own studies in oils. But at night, they did postcards like these. So there is the formal side that one sees of the introduction, the academy side that one sees of Meiji art creation. But there are also other parts of it, a much more nuanced view that one gets of postcards. So not only have these works, but here's another work by Wada Eisaku. It's a combination of Western depiction, but also if you look at the background, it's a Japanese-French Art Nouveau type of depiction, which you also can see when you look at the works by Fukushima Takuji, which I showed you his painting on the left-hand side, his formal painting that he would produce to a jury. But on the right-hand side, look at his postcard. He did a whole series of these postcards with those kinds of silver swirls behind it that are very much of Art Nouveau. So it bridges the formal painting characteristics as well as the more informal design that was current at the time. And even people like Hashimoto Gaho, who was part of this very much of the establishment of the more conservative, what we would now think as the conservative Oka Kota-based artists, was also, here's his painting on the right-hand side, here's his postcard on the left-hand side. And why it becomes incredibly important is postcards are being exchanged across countries so rapidly during this period. So you have this very rich, fertile exchange of ideas that are happening between artists. And they're working, if a postcard is not an oil painting that you labor over for hours or days, a postcard is something you do at night. So it's a very spontaneous type of presentation. And so the postcard becomes that kind of medium whereby artists can show a different aspect of the work. We can understand a little bit more about what they're doing. And it's also important for Meiji art to understand there is the formal, the exhibition type of works that I've been showing you, and then there are the kinds of things that are done for domestic purposes or also just for informal purposes. But they're also very much partaking of this East-West dialogue. And it's very hard to categorize. I mean, sometimes people will look and say, oh, there's Oka Kota, and then there's Kuroda. But you can also see in these postcards how the worlds sort of collide when they're not in sort of school types or having to follow certain regimens that your teacher dictates, that there's an amount of freedom that we understand by looking at these postcards as well. Well, I just want to conclude by talking about the fact that during the Meiji era, there are just many, many things that art becomes part of national identity. Government patronage from the very beginning was crucial for this. But it was also a time of exploration and experimentation. If you think where they went from the beginning of my lecture to this, and the vast array of things, it's a sort of a dizzying idea of what happens in Japanese art during the period of Emperor Meiji's reign. And he dies in 1912. And it's not as if the world of art changes immediately when he dies, but that kind of freedom but under government and everyone signing on to a government agenda, but in very different ways, that begins to fragment itself. Each of the individuals has very different styles, but they also have a sense of representing their country in whatever they were doing. And it was just that whole time break from the arrival of Perry to the death of the Emperor Meiji. It's a dizzying idea of what happened in their world during that period. But there are personal aesthetics. It always happens. And there's a conceptual dynamic that makes it really, truly one of the most fascinating periods of Japanese art. I have to confess, I'm not a Meiji art lover, but I do think it is one of the most fascinating periods of Japanese art because there are all these contending ideas. I know that a lot of institutions, I mean, when I first studied art history, we did not study the Meiji era. And just a personal account, told one of the Harvard's leading government people who wanted me to take a course in the Meiji era, I'll never need it. I'm not taking it. And I must say that I had to, 10 years later, when I started doing this work, say, I'm really sorry. I really wished I had taken the courses now, because I've found that I still aesthetically find it challenging to say, I love these works, but on the other hand, they're so fascinating as you try to understand what Japan is negotiating in this very, very short period of time. And if you think about those Yokohama prints with the women with their hoop skirts, and then you look at some of these oil paintings, that's a long way to go in a very, very rapid time. So it's on one hand a sense of appreciation of what's happening for the future, but it's also the world start coming together that they appreciate also the past. So there are exaggerated accounts of people throwing things out or not, wanting the past. There's always that constant negotiation, and different artists did it in different ways. Some of them more aesthetically pleasing than others, but I think all of them fascinating in their own right. So I'm having to make up for all the time I didn't study Meiji history in school. I've become, I guess that's really where a lot of my work is centered recently, but it's a fascinating time period, and it really does call into question how does a country present itself, and who are the people who are supporting it? And as long as they had this sort of unified vision of doing things for the presentation of the country, getting the country into a different place, it could start taking many different forms, as you've seen with the different kinds of artworks I've shown you today, not only at the official level, but even at the most personal level, as you see in these postcards. So thank you very much, and I'd be glad to answer any questions.